much for coming along. Hopefully it'll be very, very interesting session today. So we're very grateful to have Hedi Viterbo here, who's a senior lecturer at Queen Mary University of London. And I think what's interesting as well is that he's coming from a law perspective for some of the issues that most of us maybe look at it from a criminology point of view. So he's been a visiting scholar at Harvard and Columbia University and published his most recent book last year, and that was titled Problematizing Law, Rights and Childhood in Israel and Palestine. So some of his research has looked at issues in Palestine, and he's also written an earlier article about the way in which the Israeli state divided Palestinian child prisoners from the adult population as a focus for rehabilitation and kind of alternative approaches. But what he's going to be talking about today is how such issues, how the calls for a different approach to young people in the UK and the United States especially, sometimes leaves adults out and sometimes has implicit negative messages about what is going on with the adult population or what should be done for them. So without further ado, I'd really like to give the floor to Hedi to give you as much time as possible to make your arguments.
Many thanks, Marguerite. Before I start, I should thank the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, and especially to Alistair for hosting this event, and also many thanks to Fiona for agreeing to comment later. I'll apologize in advance to all of you. I'm currently isolating with COVID, and thankfully I'm recovering now, but I do have to warn you that there might be some coughs occasionally, so don't be too alarmed. Let me try and share my slides. See? Are you able to see them now?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, so I should probably start by explaining the term decarceration, which I'll be using a lot. And there are different definitions of it, but I, like many other scholars, define it as an umbrella concept, which means that it encompasses a range of models with a common aim of either decreasing or abolishing incarceration. So these models include diversion, decriminalization, and abolition, among other things. And another term I'll be using is youth. And I prefer it to the term children for various reasons. And one reason is that in the context we're talking about today, most countries exempt preteens and obviously toddlers from incarceration. So the young people I'll be talking about are actually a much narrower age group, which is usually teenagers. So now the meaning of the phrase youth decarceration should be fairly clear. And basically it refers to the view that the incarceration of youth should be minimized or even abolished. And today I'll be examining publications that advocate youth decarceration. And this includes publications by academics, by human rights organizations, and by state officials. And as Marguerite mentioned, my focus will be on publications relating primarily to the UK and the US, mostly in the last 2 decades. And these publications promote a broad range of youth decarceration models. For example, some categorically advocate abolishing youth imprisonment, whereas others believe that a minority of youth do belong behind bars, especially those who've been convicted of grave crimes. Notwithstanding this disparity, most advocates of youth decarceration share a common characteristic, and as I'll show, they persistently lend legitimacy to the incarceration of adults who are in trouble with the law, and they do so by portraying these adults as incorrigible, blameworthy, and therefore as deserving punishment and incarceration. So as you all know, people aged 18 years or older make up the overwhelming majority of those behind bars. In Scotland, and also in England and Wales, they make up more than 99% of those in prison. In the US, the figure is more than 98%. So when it comes to most imprisoned people, the discourse of youth decarceration condones carceral thinking and potentially even entrenches it. And my argument today is different from previous critiques by other scholars. For decades, youth decarceration initiatives have been criticized, especially in the US, for their potentially detrimental impact on the young people they claim to serve. So critics have shown how these initiatives often replicate within the community the modes and logic of control that they claim and seek to replace. In addition, they often increase the number of youths and families under surveillance. Sometimes they also expand the powers of the penal system. These criticisms are highly valuable, but my argument is different in two respects. First of all, my focus isn't actually on youth. Instead, I turn the spotlight elsewhere to the potentially negative implications for adults in conflict with the law. In some of my previous work, I've argued that policies and discourses that appear to be focused on children are often equally concerned with adults. And these adults aren't just those who are in charge of children, such as parents, teachers, and social workers. They also include other adults, such as imprisoned adults, who are the focus of my talk today. A second difference from previous criticisms is that I'm not making any argument about the impact of youth decarceration initiatives. Instead, what I'm providing is a critical discourse analysis. So my aim is to unmask a rhetoric that seems to oppose incarceration. And I'll be doing this by revealing how this rhetoric actually endorses the incarceration of most people behind bars. So that's my first argument. My second one is that those who push for youth decarceration often disregard the vulnerability of adults. And I'll focus on one example, which throws this problem into sharp relief, and that's the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. I'll show how some organizations called for youth to be prioritized for release from prisons, even though adults are actually more medically vulnerable to COVID-19. My third argument is that claims in support of youth decarceration assume that differences based on age are natural and self-evident. I'll explain why this assumption is ageist, why it relies on questionable science, and why age differences are much more socially constructed than we're usually led to believe. And lastly, I'll argue that the problems I'm pointing to are not unique to the context of decarceration. They're a symptom of broader pitfalls of the child rights framework, and I'll illustrate this point through examples from some other contexts. Just to clarify, and this is really important, I'm not calling for children to be denied rights. On the contrary, my argument is that the dominant framework of child rights fails to properly empower and protect them. If anything, I believe they deserve more empowerment and better protection. And another thing, before I continue, I should clarify that my criticism is not a criticism of decarceration, quite the opposite. There are compelling reasons to support decarceration. My argument is simply that we need to challenge both carceral thinking and ageism. And in order to do that, we need a bolder decarceration vision, which would benefit people across the age spectrum. So my focus isn't really on whether or why decarceration is justified, but just for those who are less familiar with this topic, let me briefly mention some key problems concerning imprisonment. And these problems don't exist in all prisons, certainly not to the same extent, but they have been reported to exist in prisons across most parts of the world. So one issue, as you can see, is the disproportionate incarceration of people from marginalized, disadvantaged, and disempowered groups. Another issue is the prison conditions, which sometimes include the lack of proper care, underqualified and overstretched staff, prevalent racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia, and cultures of violence and fear. Yet another problem is the failure of imprisonment and punishment to achieve their stated objectives, both in terms of sufficiently reducing crime and meeting the needs of victims. There's also the fact that many people are held behind bars for non-violent offenses, or even for technical violations of their probation conditions. And on top of this, prosecution and incarceration come at an immense financial cost, and this money could have benefited other social avenues, such as anti-poverty initiatives, community empowerment programs, affordable housing, welfare services, better equality healthcare and education, and recreational projects. Now, some advocates of youth decarceration have mentioned these issues, but they've repeatedly associated them primarily, if not exclusively, with youth, which gives the wrong impression that imprisoned adults are less exposed to these problems. So let's see how proponents of youth decarceration lend legitimacy to the incarceration of adults. And they do so in different ways. Some are implicit and others more explicit. Let's start with some representative examples of implicit legitimation. So one example is the call for youth in conflict with the law to be treated as children, not offenders. A similar example is the claim that they should be viewed as children first, offenders second. Another example is the depiction of childhood and prison as two mutually exclusive realms. So some advocates of youth decarceration argue that children do not belong in prison. Others say that prison is not a place for children. There are those who claim that imprisonment deprives youth not only of their liberty, but also of their childhood. One last example of implicit legitimation for adult incarceration is the call to decarcerate youth because they're the future of our nation. Now, even though this rhetoric uses the words children and youth, it also has implications for adults. After all, if prison is not a place for children, then whom is it for? If youth are the future, whose potential is less valuable? If children are not offenders, then who does deserve to be labeled an offender? If youth in conflict with the law are children first, offenders second, whose offending is not secondary? Is incarceration any less deplorable when those affected by it are deemed too old to be denied their childhood? The answer to all of these questions is one and the same, which is that the rhetoric of youth decarceration is premised on the belief that adults are less deserving of mercy. After all, if they too had been depicted as adults, not offenders, or as adults first, offenders second, or as belonging outside prison, or as society's future, or as having their adulthood denied by incarceration, then singling out youth would have neither made sense nor be necessary. Youth decarceration could then have been replaced by a bolder decarceration vision, one that views everyone in trouble with the law, regardless of their age, as people, not offenders. Occasionally, proponents of youth decarceration are more explicit in calling for adults to be denied leniency. And there are many examples, but I'll focus on one representative one, which appears in an article from 2015, which has also been cited by the Center for Youth and Criminal Justice. And here's a quote from the article. Adults are responsible for making their own decisions in life and for bearing the consequences of their decision-making. Adults are responsible for decisions where children are not. Youth should be spared sentences that resemble those handed down to adults. Broadly, fines, community service, community supervision, and imprisonment. So, in other words, incarceration and punitiveness are presented as perfectly legitimate as long as they're targeted at adults. So as we can see so far, the youth decarceration discourse doesn't challenge carceral thinking in any fundamental way. On the contrary, it repeatedly describes adults in trouble with the law as incorrigible, culpable, and as deserving punishment, including incarceration. In addition, this discourse also feeds into the punitive fixation with blame. And by this, I'm referring to the fixation with dividing people into those who are blameworthy and those who are deemed less blameworthy. But the youth decarceration discourse suffers from another pitfall. It ignores and even downplays adult vulnerability. And a growing literature has called into question dominant assumptions about vulnerability. Various scholars have shown how young age doesn't neatly correlate with vulnerability. And this fact is not often sufficiently acknowledged, but there is one context where it's virtually undisputed, and that's the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. Since the early stages of the pandemic, it became common knowledge that the youngest members of society were generally the least medically vulnerable to COVID-19. In contrast, older age is one of the strongest predictors of mortality from the disease. This has clear implications for prison populations, because as you all are probably aware, prisons around the world have been hotbeds of infection. They're often overcrowded, unsanitary, poorly ventilated, and with substandard healthcare. The population has high rates of pre-existing medical conditions, which make it especially vulnerable to COVID. And there have been some attempts to enforce social distancing in prisons without reducing crowding, but these attempts have proven unfeasible, and they've also infringed on the basic rights of those behind bars, in addition to increasing their risk of suffering violence and self-harm. As a result, during the first year of the pandemic, around the world, hundreds of thousands of people were released from prisons. Add to this the fact that the average age of those behind bars is increasingly higher than that of the general public. For this reason, many of the countries that pursued decarceration during the pandemic included older age among the release criteria. Now, the mass release from prison across many countries during the pandemic posed a unique opportunity for those who oppose incarceration. It offered an opportunity to decarcerate people of all ages. But some human rights organizations argued that youth were those who should be prioritized for release from prisons. This argument blatantly ignored the fact that adults were more medically vulnerable to COVID, especially behind bars. So here are two examples. The first is a publication by UNICEF, which was endorsed by 14 NGOs and 4 UN bodies. It called, and I quote, for the prioritizing of children for immediate release. And it added, public authorities should exercise their detention powers cautiously, considering the heightened vulnerability of the child, particularly in the current context of COVID-19. States should prioritize the diversion of children away from formal justice processes, end quote. The second example has to do with an organization that isn't normally focused on children's rights. It's a forum of UN and other humanitarian organizations called the Interagency Standing Committee. It argued, and I quote, that detention, even as a last resort, is never in the best interest of a child. Thus, non-custodial alternatives to detention should be favored for any person under 18 years, especially in the context of COVID-19, end quote. This language left open the possibility that for adults, incarceration is justifiable even during the pandemic. So, as we've seen, proponents of youth decarceration describe youth as more deserving of decarceration than adults. And this argument is based on the belief that there are distinct age groups, naturally and universally, and that these age groups have inherently unique characteristics and needs. This belief is widely held, but it's highly problematic. It boxes people into the rigid binary of either child or adult, and in that sense, it's ageist. Now, normally we associate ageism with older age, but what we're seeing here is pure ageism towards both young and adult people. Proponents of youth decarceration make all sorts of claims about age differences. One common claim is that youth are naturally impulsive, reckless, prone to irrationality, and susceptible to negative social influences. These traits are then attributed, at least partly, to the alleged psychological and neurological immaturity of these young people. These claims are not only ageist, they also rely on very questionable science. Developmental psychology specifically has attracted growing academic criticism. And some examples are the critical works of scholars such as Erica Berman, John Morse, and Wendy Staten-Rogers. As they all argue, developmental psychology is a reductive enterprise, and it is designed to create rational humans that are amenable to existing socioeconomic power relations. Brain development studies have also been roundly criticized by scholars such as Judith Basant, Peter Kelly, and Alexandra Cox, among others. As they argue, studies of adolescent brain development make contested and constantly changing assumptions about brain activity. Brain development studies also ignore countless variables that may influence the brain. And they also generalize based on participants from particular social backgrounds. The brain maps they create are oversimplified for media and statistical purposes. And in addition, testing in a lab setting is inevitably limited. And beyond all of that, we know that human development is heavily affected by social stimuli. And it's only in modern times that these social stimuli have become highly regimented by how old a person is. So today, experiences and knowledge that are deemed age inappropriate, quote unquote, are withheld from many young people well into their teens, if not beyond. So it's no wonder that they appear to be less developed. All of this is also borne out by historical and anthropological studies of childhood. As these studies show, many of the current differences between those we now call children and those we call adults are quite a recent development. In earlier societies, these differences either didn't exist or were much less pronounced. And this is because the youngest members of society would mix with their elders in public. They would absorb similar information, and they would perform similar tasks or labor. Until well into the 19th century, a person's date of birth was rarely known, let alone celebrated or accurately recorded. And this is still true for hundreds of millions of people around the world. A person's status at the time changed gradually or through rites of passage rather than on the basis of their age. And in addition, until recent times, legislation based on age was rare and was mostly unenforced. When people in prison started being separated, it wasn't by their age. Instead, they were separated by their perceived character, the severity of their offenses, and whether they had prior criminal record. There were also no laws requiring universal compulsory education, and in the schools that did exist, each classroom would have students across a very broad age range. We can also gain relevant insight from anthropology. As I've mentioned, advocates of youth decarceration have a very culturally specific notion of adolescence. They assume that it's a naturally turbulent period of life. But as anthropological studies have long shown, some societies have had none of this adolescent unrest. What this suggests is that age differences might diminish significantly if we were to dismantle the attitudes and institutions that perpetuate and amplify these differences. In other words, the rhetoric of youth decarceration doesn't simply reflect a natural and universal childhood. Instead, it reinforces a certain model of childhood, and this model of childhood is ageist. It's culturally and historically specific, and it also relies on questionable science. Now, advocates of youth decarceration often cite children's rights. Often they also cite international law. And one of the most commonly cited documents is the Convention on the Rights of the Child, which, as some of you know, is also the most widely ratified treaty in the world. So, as you can see, according to Article 37b of the Convention, and I quote, the arrest, detention, or imprisonment of a child shall be used only as a measure of last resort, end quote. But international law doesn't afford this leniency to adults. The closest provision, which applies to people of all ages, is found in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, but it only prohibits arresting or locking up a person arbitrarily or without due process. So in this way, the law, including child rights law, reserves special protection exclusively for the young, and in so doing, it paves the way for the continued incarceration of adults. And this pitfall is not unique to the context I've been talking about. There are various other contexts in which the child rights discourse denies leniency and compassion to those it defines as adults. For example, Akila Ananth has researched some reforms to family courts in the US. She looked at attempts to redesign these courts in a so-called child-sensitive way, and she found that these reforms have depicted the adults who are brought before the court as culpable criminals who need to be sent to prison. Similarly, Erica Berman has written about how humanitarian aid campaigns tend to privilege children. As she argues, this casts adults as less worthy of assistance and empathy. Another case in point is armed conflict. I think I skipped a slide earlier, so hopefully it's fine now. And this is an example in two respects. First of all, in my research on Israel-Palestine, I've shown how Israel doesn't simply disregard international legal norms regarding children's rights. Instead, what Israeli authorities have done is increasingly use the language of children's rights and international law as tools for oppressing, governing, and disciplining Palestinian adults, including those who are held in Israeli prisons. Another issue has been pointed out by Charlie Carpenter in her study of how international organizations protect civilians in conflict zones. As she argues, the conflation of both children and women with innocent and vulnerable civilians harms adult men. First of all, it overlooks civilian men who are not combatants. Second, it disregards the higher exposure of men to certain forms of state violence. And third, it even facilitates the indiscriminate targeting of men by the warring parties. Against this backdrop, it becomes evident that the problems I've identified are not entirely unique to the rhetoric of youth decarceration. Instead, they're a symptom of a broader pitfall of the child's rights discourse. In fact, the dominant discourse of child rights sometimes harms not only adults, but also those it defines as children. Earlier, I mentioned how youth decarceration has been criticized for replicating and expanding the modes of control that it claims to replace. But there are other contexts in which the discourse of child rights harms children. For example, in a recent publication, I highlighted some of the unintended consequences of the separation of children and adults in prisons. As I've shown, many children have been needlessly subjected to solitary confinement simply because this was seen as necessary for keeping them separate from adults. In other publications, I've shown how children under colonial or military rule have been systematically removed from their older counterparts and exposed to great harm, and how all of this was then presented as a protective measure. Another example has to do with working children. Many scholars, some of whom are mentioned on the slide, have sharply criticized policies that aim to abolish what is known as child labor. These policies often end up pushing children into more hazardous and exploitative work. Meanwhile, what gets ignored is the voices and wishes of these children themselves, who often view their work as beneficial or at least necessary. Similarly, other scholars such as Aoife Daly and Laura Lundy have critically examined the so-called right of the child to be heard. This right is framed extremely vaguely in both international and national laws. And as a result, adult decision makers are effectively allowed to disregard children's views if they're different from their own views. And these are just a few examples, and I'm happy to elaborate further, but hopefully they give you a sense of my point. And what we see is that the youth decarceration discourse is an example of two broader pitfalls of child rights. One is that the framework of child rights legitimizes harm and apathy to adults. And the other is that it repeatedly harms children, and it also disregards their own views. As I emphasized earlier, my point here isn't that children should be denied rights or protection. On the contrary, I'm arguing that both children and adults deserve better protection and more equitable treatment. In that sense, the dominant child rights framework does a disservice to people of all ages, even if this is often done with the best of intentions. So to conclude, let's return the focus to youth decarceration. As you've seen, I avoid speculating on why proponents of youth decarceration make the sort of arguments that they do. And I'm happy to explain why I avoid this sort of analysis. But for the sake of argument, let's assume that they're saying what they're saying for strategic reasons. In other words, let's assume that they're legitimizing adult punishment for strategic purposes. The problem is that if that's what they're doing, then this is a very questionable strategy in two respects. First of all, as I've mentioned, scholars have shown how youth decarceration can have a harmful impact, even on the young people that it seeks to serve. Second, there's no reason to assume that if fewer youths are incarcerated, then the number of adults in prison would also drop as a result. For example, in England and Wales, the youth incarceration rate shrunk in the 1980s, and then again throughout most of the past 2 decades. But the adult incarceration rate remained fairly stable during these periods. Similarly, in Canada, the youth incarceration rate has dropped by a staggering 73% over the past 2 decades, but the adult incarceration rate has remained virtually unchanged. Sometimes a reduction in youth incarceration can actually be accompanied by an increase in adult incarceration. We can see this happening in local jails in the US. The youth population there nearly halved between 2005 and 2017, but the number of adults actually increased. So this indicates that the youth decarceration rhetoric is not only ageist, but even from a strategic perspective, it might have undesirable results. And I'll stop here. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to hearing Fiona's thoughts. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Hedi. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of questions about that kind of interesting and provocative presentation, but I think it's only right that Fiona gets to maybe have first go at this. Just to give her a brief introduction, she's the director of the Children and Young People Centre for Justice, and that centre works towards better outcomes for children and young people in conflict with the law in Scotland. But Fiona herself has also published extensively on young people's experiences and their treatment by the justice system in Scotland. And before she was the director of the CICJ, she was a social work advisor to the government and to lead on the whole systems approach. And she's lots of experience as a social worker and social work manager within youth and criminal justice in Scotland as well. Fiona.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Marguerite. And thank you, Dr. Viterbo. It's such an interesting talk. Before we start, I think you'll be pleased to know that actually in Scotland during COVID, the COVID legislation ignored children, and actually 340 adults were released from custody and 1 child under 18. So there, Scotland has ignored children in relation to COVID, even though 85% of children are on remand and therefore not convicted, compared to 20% of adults being on remand. So it's something obviously we were quite disappointed with, that children were ignored from COVID legislation. But anyway, before we start, I'd just like to say I do agree with you that we need to take the needs of everybody into account as part of decarceration and indeed incarceration, and not just children. And this is not a binary choice, and people can be supportive of a focus on both. However, I do not agree that the call for a reduction in youth incarceration is at the detriment of adults. And indeed, I believe there is evidence that when we do focus on children and their rights, that there is subsequently a positive impact on the adult justice population, and the numbers are actually reducing in the adult justice system, especially the prison population. But before I present that evidence, I would just like to demonstrate why I think we should focus on children. And that is because I believe they are more vulnerable than adults. And it's not to say some adults are not vulnerable, but children are more vulnerable. And then I believe they do deserve a focus. You'd put up some comments that children are not offenders, children first, offenders second, prison's not a place for children, and Manfred Novak's The Deprivation of Childhood by having children in custody. And I have to say, I agree with all those statements. I believe children from birth are reliant on adults, as we know, for care and protection, and they have little choice in what's provided and little influence over this. And for a lot of children, majority of children, in fact, who are in the justice system, they're often living with trauma, domestic violence, parental mental health issues and abuse. And they're often exploited by adults. And they are also unable to influence how the state's governed due to being unable to vote due to their age. You touched on brain development as well. And during adolescence, we now know the evidence that our brains are not fully developed until we're actually 25. And that there's this imbalance actually looks at the prefrontal cortex of the brain, which is responsible for more risk-taking behaviour. And findings suggest that as this is the last part to grow, so that reaching maturity as well with sort of puberty has got a real underlying issue and impact on poor problem solving, poor information processing, poor decision making and risk-taking behaviours, and they're the last to fully develop and function. And evidence suggests that the influence or presence of peers further exacerbates these tendencies. So research shows us that young people are not fully developed and they don't reach full maturity. And adolescence is a time of increasing independence and exploration, but often characterised by these poor decision making and impaired problem solving. And as a result, children are less likely to use good judgment, they're more vulnerable to negative influences, and they're really unable to think about the consequences of their actions, and therefore, as a result, they are more vulnerable. And when you look at the impact of traumatised children and their experiences, which further impacts on brain development and how that functions and at the normal trajectory, we know that that is impacting on brain development, and again on children who are involved in the youth justice and in conflict with the law, further impacts on their ability to make positive decisions. Therefore, we need to focus on children because due to these reasons, they are more vulnerable. And there's widespread global concerns about the detention of children, as you've highlighted, and that very short periods of detention can actually undermine a child's psychological and physical well-being and compromise that cognitive development. Prison doesn't provide the care and protection that nurture warmth and trusted relationships that children need to develop. And therefore it impedes development and at a crucial stage of a child's development. Research shows us that negative and unexpected consequences of children's detention are worse than previously thought. And there's a real impact on detaining children on their cognitive functioning, physical development and long-term health. They're often denied the nutrition they need to develop and grow, and they're excluded from exercise and education, and their social skills also suffer. And it's due to the above that they find it hard to avoid, it's due to the above that they find it hard to avoid adult incarceration. But just to quickly focus on my second point, through focusing on neurodevelopment of children, we have shifted practice for young people now, because brain development's up to 26. So when we talk about children and young people and really looking at brain development, we're including adults as you have defined them, because we're including 18 to 26-year-olds within that. And there's a new focus now on children and young adults up to age 26. And indeed in Scotland, we introduced new sentencing guidelines on Wednesday, which takes maturity into account when children and young adults are appearing in court. So we are shifting perception of how adults in custody are viewed by that focus. And in terms of their own childhood experiences and how we support them to change their behaviour, they were once children, and if their rights has been focused, then the outcome may have been more positive. So to turn to my second point and to demonstrate some evidence that undermine, I believe, your argument in relation to children's rights being detrimental to adults, I think you touched on it, but in relation to England and Wales, because 2008 to 10, while the number of children detained fell by almost a third, there wasn't the equivalent reduction, as you're true to point out, in relation to adults. But when we look forward between 2010 and 2019, the young adult prison population had reduced by 52%. Now, under 18 still continue to fall quicker by 68%, but this delay of 2 years is consistent with a filtering through process that the large majority of children deprived of their liberty are within the 16 to 18 age group, and they would become young adults over that time frame. But it's significant too that this pattern cannot be explained simply in terms of wider custodial trends, as you say, the adult population was actually increasing at that time. But more recently, trends have now started to show that the adult 25 plus population are now also in decline. And trends in relation to youth imprisonment, thus, I would argue, have a broader ramifications and extend beyond the boundaries of the youth justice system. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Fiona. That's great.